Okay, folks. So tonight I'm going to talk in the first half about the range of edible crops available to us, and in the second half about how to time our whole approach to the growing season, the growing year, which is quite a chore. It's quite a challenge in terms of, unless you've actually lived it, my words will just be words, as with everything else I talk about. But yeah, to try and give you a bit of an overview of what's possible, the handout that you've got dates from late 60s, so it's now 50 years old, and this was actually done by Lawrence Hills, the man who started the Henry Doubleday Research Association, the HDRA, who were the champions of home growing for about 20-30 years, and have now turned into a marketing organisation called Grow Organic, who will sell you something organic if you get the chance, if you've got enough money. And on one side, I think he liked the poetic resonance of calling it the vegetable table. And that's a good rough guide about which crops we should be thinking about starting off when. And that's just the start of it, because once you've started something, you've got to see it through and look after it like a child after that. So on the other side of that piece of paper, this is the bit to, I think, stimulate and rile you and think, this man. But what he's telling you is what you could be eating at different times of year from your own growing, if you've done enough of the things on the first side to actually get them started. And this relates to a kind of ongoing escalator of increasing the number of crops you're growing and the number of things, therefore, you end up eating a bit later in the year. But to get on this bandwagon of growing, you really need to just start with a few things: what suits you, what appeals to you, maybe also what's easiest. But the underlying recommendation from me is, rather than just thinking about it as you sow everything in the spring and then different things come on at different times, to try and keep growing and starting different things off almost throughout the year. And that would include, even at midwinter, there's some seeds you could be starting, like peppers and aubergines and onions, and also things like garlic outside. And I sow my peas and beans in November, so they're just germinating at midwinter. And then that keeps my interest going. So rather than having completely bare soil and nothing apparent. And that's part of the explanation for the range of crops I've got here. Some of them are last year's, they've all been started off last year. The point being, anything we can have for growing at this time of year and for the next 3 months, that is the hungry gap. When the stored crops, like the roots, parsnips and carrots over there, will be finishing up fairly soon and bolting and going to flower. And other things are only just getting started, if that. So this is building up to filling the hardest time of year, which is this hungry gap time. So it's actually a contradiction that you think, people come out to my projects in spring, in April and May, when they come out of hibernation, and they think, where's all this local food then? Feed me. But of course, we've only just started the process for that year at that time. And also, I'll come back to this in the second half, but the general approach would be to think about how long the days are, and through this course we'll be going from winter, when it was cold and dark at 4 o'clock, through to pretty much the start of summer. By the end of the course, we'll have light evenings. It'll still be light outside till about 7 or 8 o'clock, especially when the clocks change. And so this is partly about our internal motivation and how we escape from the expectation that every day is the same, because we're in centrally heated offices and we never look outside the window, and we're not in contact with either the day length or the weather. And fundamentally, if we think about day length and the calendar time of year, if you add 6 weeks onto that, then you're starting to synchronise your activities with what the soil and the plants are actually experiencing. And that is also relating to, they don't have the benefit of central heating and being cosseted from the outside environment. They're out there 24/7 in the chilly cold in winter and the hot sun in the summer. So it's just trying to adapt our whole approach to be synchronised with what plants are experiencing. And most of that, I'll come back and think about time and timing in the second half. But yeah, the first half, if we just think about the range of crops that are available to us, and again, it's another adaptation. Spare one of those. Anybody hasn't mind, Zoe? Yeah. So, I actually went to the supermarket last week. Very rare experience. And I was bowled over by the amazing range and cheapness of all the vegetables there, which reminded me there's not a lot of economic foundation to what we're doing. I can't sell this stuff cheaper than the big guys can grow it still. Although it's this notching up effect that all the time that oil prices are going up, our food is going to get more expensive, and therefore if we think ahead in 5 or 10 years' time, then it might actually pay off in economic bottom line terms. But yeah, to take our existing conception of what food is at different times of year, which most of us will get from the supermarket, and try to change that, to change our diets to what we can actually grow. And that's quite a big challenge. If you've got money and you've still got the option of going to the supermarket, surely it's easier to do that, but not as satisfying. And just to illustrate, this lovely book here, the Oxford Book of Food Plants, this is the very concise version. It's only got a couple of hundred things in there. But it does include all the tropical crops and all the exotics and all the things that are actually beyond what we can grow easily in this climate. And the more things that we can grow outdoors without any extra heat, without any preparation and extra meddling, the easier it is for us as growers. And actually this selection benefits from partly coming from inner city garden growing spaces like the Huerta. And this garden mint, I was amazed down the Huerta, that's already shooting, and we've already got shoots, so we can have some of that for tea later. But up on the allotments on the hill, that's still below ground, and it's being wise and waiting till the weather's definitely warm enough. And so this is the proposition that gradually we wean ourselves off of what we're supplied with from the other side of the world and start to actually prefer and favour and put more effort into growing things that we can get from our own growing. And if we have a look at the charts in here, page 38, the edible crops, that's just for reference, I'll come back to that in a minute. But that's the range of crops. 90% of what we can grow is in this list, and it's in different groupings. We're trying to change our expectations, adapt our diet. So very briefly looking at this list first, and I'll go through that with pictures in a minute. These are grouped together in botanical groupings, and that gives you the genus, the overall category that different crops go into, and then it has species and variety within that, each of which helps to define what we're actually talking about. And these categories are in one sense fairly arbitrary. So if we look at something like what's called brassicas or cruciferae, which is cabbages and mustards, their shared characteristic is their flower has 4 petals, whereas over on the other side, rosaceae, which is a lot of the fruits, classically the flowers have 5 petals. And within that group especially, you've got things like apples and strawberries. Now, I don't see how a tree is related to a strawberry. They're kind of perennials, but they've got similar flower. And so in botanical classification, that means they end up in the same group. And one of the rationales behind understanding it in this form is to think about if one crop is in the same family as another, it may well require the same growth requirements to get it growing, and also share pests and or diseases. So if we relate this to raised beds, we might have a bed for each of these groupings and then cycle them around each year. That's a suggestion. And one problem with this is it has got the Latin names, but that's using Latin as a lingua franca. It's a universal language that everyone around the world will understand and recognise. So if you're talking to someone from abroad, or someone who's got a different language, they will still hopefully understand that as a way of describing different plants, because you can get mixed up. And just to introduce you very briefly to the Latin, there's things like, we've got brown mustard is Brassica nigra, which nigra means black. There's various words like sativa, which means the best. Officinalis, which relates to, that would be of medicinal use in some way, and kept in the office. There's vulgaris, which just means from the field. Cochineus, which means red. So some of these, I'm suggesting we can have a bit of a clue about some of their characteristics just from the name. Let's just go through and see if there's any more. But yeah, not to be put off, parsley is Petrosolinum crispum. So it's crisp, crunchy. So don't be dissuaded if Latin isn't your kind of native speaking language, which none of it is for any of us. But yeah, to try and pay some attention, especially to the bigger groupings and some of the characteristics within that, and that gives us a kind of shared understanding of what we're talking about. Also, one comment, the botanical classifications do shift and change, and they have great big world symposiums to decide that they're going to change the name of these groups, and then all the botanists have to learn another name. So that's the reason that the first group, the Graminae, is also called the Poaceae. One name has supplanted the other, actually in recent times, and similarly the Brassicaceae really ought to be called the Cruciferae now. So there's various changes like that, but a lot of people remember one name from the past and have still got their minds, so it's worth kind of keeping that going. So we just get these very basic characteristics, some of which I've been mentioning through the course. So the legumes, leguminosae, they all fix nitrogen. So it's the beans and the peas. And it also includes the nitrogen-fixing crops like vetches and clovers. The Polygonaceae, that's the seed shape is a four-sided triangle, basically. And the asters, or composite flowers, the daisy family, we all know what daisies look like, and actually a daisy is made up of hundreds of individual florets which make up one flower. So that's the composite, because they're composed together like that. The labiates, labia means lip, and if you look at the flower of things like mint, basil, they will have this drooping, longer, extended lower lip, and that gives you a definition. So once you've recognised one or two within that group, you can start to recognise the other ones. And also, once you've grown something from each of these groups, you've got a greater confidence that you can grow other members of that same family. Apiaceae are umbrellifer. They've got umbrella-shaped flowers, and yeah, they're especially attractant to bees and flowers. The chenopod's, and that includes beetroots. If you look at a beetroot seed, it's actually a fruit, and it's got a cluster of several seeds within a kind of hard body, which is actually a little fruitlet. And the Solanaceae, that's the nightshade family, and yeah, they all have a slightly sinister look to them, and like I've mentioned, some people are slightly allergic to some of them. The cucurbits, including the squashes and the courgettes and cucumbers, that's the gourd family, and the Rosaceae and the Cannabaceae. So that's not a completely inclusive list, and if you do have a look in this book, you'll find all these other wonderful crops. One note of caution, we can grow things like lemons in this climate, but only if we've got extra heat. And a lot of people have put things like bananas in their gardens in the last few years, especially if they live in the middle of London, and they can get away with it. But I don't know if you noticed this year, all the yuccas, or yucca-type plants that people have planted in their gardens and they've been growing for 20 years, that hard weather in November has killed nearly all of them. So there's lovely dead yuccas around. I'm going to come back to that shortly, show you some pictures to illustrate all that lot. But I'll just go on to illustrate the crop terms, which is on the other side. And so we're thinking about the value of these groupings means that we've got a shared understanding that one member of each family, each genus, will have shared growth habits with others. And that can be relevant to how much we have to fertilise them, when and how we need to pollinate different crops. Like sweet corn needs wind to pollinate it. But also, this is thinking about shared origins and the social and economic significance of different plants. So if we just look at the very first, back to the first group, the Poaceae, we've got corn, wheat, rye, barley, oats, millet and rice and rye. And I think that makes up about 80% of the world's food. So that's half a dozen plants, half a dozen genuses. Within that you've got lots of subspecies and local varieties. But they're very dominant in terms of they produce the vast mass of carbohydrates that go into our diet. And each one of those will have massive economic significance. Like, we're just listening to that program about Japan, some of us, the food program. They're trying to grow more food in Japan because they don't want to import so much. And they're lucky because they've actually protected their rice growers throughout. They've been wealthy enough to say, right, you stay on the land as peasants and we'll actually pay you to carry on growing rice. So that they've got a bit of kind of self-sufficiency as a nation. But yeah, that reflects the significance of that one crop rice. They are a rice culture. And if you go around the world, other things like sorghum and millet in Africa are also absolutely crucial to people's diet. So a lot of the time you've got those major staples, and I don't know whether, this book here, Seeds of Change, Henry Hobhouse, he lists about half a dozen crops from around the world, and those are some of the most important in history. Sugar, tea, cotton, and the potato. But what does he list first? What's the most important crop in terms of going off around the world and robbing other people's food off them and taking it back as an empire back so we can eat it? Well, it's quinine. Because if we go abroad, we get malaria. If you live abroad already and you've got sickle cell genes, then you're immune to malaria, and it doesn't matter. But if we want to go and get the rice and sugar and tea off these other cultures, we had to get quinine before, otherwise we'd get malaria. Fascinating book, and that's a whole other study, that. So yeah, I'm just going to go through these crop terms very briefly. So botanically, we group together different plants under their family name, their species name. We give them a variety name and often a cultivar. So if you're looking at a seed packet and it says Henry's peas or whatever, that is the common or maybe the cultivar name. And then the variety, species and family tells you more about their actual botany and their origins and what they're related to. The monocotyledons and dicotyledons relates to whether they have one seed leaf, which is things like onions and also those grains like wheat, or most of the crops have two seed leaves, dicotyledons. And that just describes how many leaves they have as soon as the seed germinates and comes out of the ground. And then various forms of grouping together different plants. So from a practical point of view and thinking about tonight's subject, when do they crop, which would be what you could be eating side of that chart. Just by season, spring, summer, autumn, winter is one way of thinking about it. But we've also got early, main and late as a description. So like with something like cauliflowers and calabres, you can buy dozens of different varieties which are actually bred to crop at different times of the year. And also with potatoes, we buy early potatoes, main crop potatoes and late crop potatoes. Now that doesn't mean you have to plant the different types at different times. What it refers to is, in the case of potatoes, that some potato plants will set tubers early in their life. So it really means that when they're still young as plants and just flowering, there'll already be some potatoes forming at the root. Whereas other types, if you lift them at that stage when they're flowering, they won't have any potatoes formed yet. You have to leave them right till the end, till they're dying down, and things like pink fir apple would actually be in that category. You have to leave them a long time before you actually lift the crop. And then other ways of thinking about it, lifespan of the crop, is it an annual or perennial, or a biennial? And within those categories, we might want to say whether they're frost tender. So half hardy would mean that most winters they'd survive, but frost tender means you've got to protect that plant from frost until the last frosts are finished and harden them off before you plant them out. I've bracketed triennial within biennial. And that relates to things like kales, where if you pick off each shoot and stop it going to flower, it'll carry on through and live for an extra year and give you a second season's cropping from the same plants. And evergreen and deciduous in the case of trees, whether they hold their leaves over the winter or whether they drop them. Fertility requirements, we can think about that either in terms of, are they heavy, light feeders, or are they nitrogen fixers? So that's in terms of requirements, what are they going to take out of the ground? A lot of the greens here would be secondary feeders, so light feeders. So I'll have a main crop in the summer, and then when that's finished, scatter some of these seeds, and they'll use up whatever fertility is left. But I don't have to fertilise specifically to get these crops, a lot of these light feeders going. And nitrogen fixers, again, that's back to that grouping of legumes, peas and beans. And then we've already thought about, do they need nitrogen, which would feed the leaf growth? Do they need potash, which would especially feed root growth? Or in the case of, if they're fruiting, do they need phosphorus? And each crop's going to be slightly different, but that's a general grouping of that. And another one, some crops really love lime, they're calciphiles, but some crops really don't love it. They can't handle. And I've actually made this mistake of putting lime in a bit too much before tomatoes, and the tomatoes sulk and they don't want to grow. So tomatoes and potatoes would be the two crops which I'd avoid putting lime in beforehand. And then we've also thought about soil already and tried to get some appreciation that there are all these different types of soil, and that was the proposition that if you wanted to grow a really big crop of carrots, you wouldn't grow it on clay soil. You'd actually move or travel to where there is good sandy soil, and sand will be a much easier base medium to grow a crop like carrots. Things like for heavy clay, fruit is a really good idea. Perennials, depending on if you've got an unimproved bit of your garden, that might be better for your fruit that you had last week. And just trying to associate, particularly the origins of plants. So where did they originate, and therefore can you replicate the same conditions that they experienced when they evolved? So I put coastal and maritime at the end there, and I'm just thinking about beetroots and also sea kale. I don't know if you've seen that. It grows on the beach near Brighton. But both of those crops, and therefore both of those families of crops, so that's brassicas and chenopod's, beetroot family, they don't mind a bit of salt, and they quite appreciate tough conditions like you get by the seaside. And another one I've dropped in here, number 6, I'm actually going to deal with this a lot more next week, but just to seed your mind with the idea, when I'm growing a crop, I think about which part of the plant am I actually wanting to eat. So if I leave it all the way through, that would be a seed. I'd eat the seeds of certain things, but we can eat shoots, leaves, stems. I've got some nice gailan here, which is actually a stem crop. It's got a flower, it's got leaves, but it's got a nice thick stem. Some of them are stem crops, gailan or kailan. Oh, the bud, and actually thinking about it, calabres and cauliflower, they're actually the buds of flowers. So they're not the actual flower, but also we can eat the flowers or the fruits or the roots. So it's all these different groupings, categorising things. In some sense, we could just think fruits, herbs and vegetables, because a lot of people approach food growing purely from the point of view of a dozen classic standard summer vegetables, and they don't think about growing herbs, and they never even thought about growing fruit. But what I'm trying to encourage you to is to get breadth and try and a couple of fruits, a couple of herbs, a couple of vegetables, not just concentrate on one area. And growth habits, this is also relevant when we think about companion planting. So if we combine tall things basically with short things, we can plant them closer and they'll grow better together. I've put in here about, this is determinate and indeterminate. I'm bamboozling you with terms, but this is specifically in terms of tomatoes. Some of them, we allow them to grow all the shoots out as a bush, especially the small cherry tomatoes, and they'll do well in a pot or a bucket. And those we call determinate. They stop growing of their own accord, form flowers and fruits. Whereas indeterminate, which is classic greenhouse tomatoes, where you grow them up one single long stem, so they grow tall, and you take all the side shoots off, like we did. We'll do that again. And that's a vine or indeterminate form of growth. And you can change one into another. That's it. And where are the roots? Are the roots just forming at the surface, or are they deep rooting? And again, if we combine two plants with different root systems, we can grow them closer together, and they'll have different requirements on the soil. And then growth requirements. Some things need heat, the half-hardy things, to keep them through the winter. Other things would actually prefer shade. And again, if we think about the origins of things, specifically in the case of apples, there's a lot of varieties that are bred to grow to the north of Sheffield, and therefore they want cooler conditions. But then there are some varieties that would do well down in the West Country in Devon and Cornwall, or even in France. And so just within our growing arrangement, we might have a sunny spot, which would be good for the southern varieties, and a shady spot, which would be good for the northern varieties, and try to meet their individual needs. In terms of seed, this term landrace, that describes when one variety of a certain plant has basically become indigenous in a given area. So it's been grown for so many years, and the seed just drops off, and it comes up again without any intervention, and that is a stable variety as long as it pollinates just with itself. But that will have adapted to the local conditions. And there's another box, a mixed box of seeds this evening for those of you who are taking seeds. But landrace would be what we'd prefer to be able to grow, because it's less complicated genetically and much more stable, whereas the hybrids and the F1 are much more meddled with, and it's harder to keep them going from year to year and actually save your own seed. The Terminator seed I've put in there, that's relating to genetic engineering, where they were trying to sell you seed that would not be viable when you saved your own seed. Therefore, you've got to go back and buy the seed again the next year, which is a bit of a racket, but the garden centres are right into that at the moment. And, simply the last few, use. Have we been able to crop and eat that within a matter of hours, or has it been days on the shelf, or has it been stored for ages before it gets to the shop? How fresh is it? And this term, this distinction between, I put culinary, which would mean cooking, dessert, which would mean nice to eat raw, medicinal, which would be a really strong flavour, or something that's so potent it's actually got medicinal qualities. And not forgetting, a lot of the vegetables cross over and have medicinal use in the past. And there are certain of the herbs, like evening primrose, if you grow a good enough crop and you get a great big root, you can bake the root and actually eat the roots. Same with elecampane or helenium. And then the last one of that is fodder crop, and I've shown you some humongous vegetables which actually, they're not so nice to eat, but they're great for feeding cattle. So that's that one. The quality, this is going back in the day, but we used to have different grades for produce, and they'd take it all to the shop, and the top quality would be on the table stuff and for top quality eating. Grade 2 might be just for processing, and grade 3 would be the stuff that's all nobbled and gnarled, and you've got to chop bits off before you can actually eat it. And of course, in today's world, we only ever see grade 1 or grade A produce, and that People's Supermarket programme, they've gone off to the fields to collect up what would otherwise be waste food. They wouldn't even get to the shops because it's got a slight problem with it. It's not perfect. And that relates to the last few terms, so table quality, exhibition quality and competition quality. And I'll just recommend that everyone cooperates as much as possible and don't start competing with each other. The symbols, some of those, this is really referring to bought-in produce, but also the standard bearing bodies like the Biodynamic Agriculture Association. They've got their Demeter symbol and the Soil Association organic symbol, all of which, again, just give you a reassurance that produce shouldn't have any chemicals on it. But whether it gives you much reassurance about how well it's been grown, I'm not sure. And my recommendation is, if you meet a grower who's eating his own produce every day, that's the standard that I'd go by. And obviously, when someone's growing 100 acres or something, they might eat a little bit of it, but they're not necessarily going to care about the taste of it. And the scale of production, just lastly, intensive, by which I mean not loads of extra machinery and loads of extra oil and loads of extra petrol. Intensive in terms of lots of our time and energy going into it. So that means small scale, high human intensive. And that is the most productive type of agriculture in the whole wide world. The stuff that you can actually achieve by being there and noticing and doing things. You're much, much, much more productive than the big machines and the big fields. So extensive being broad scale, i.e. lots of acres. And then these various different scales: homegrown, garden, allotment, kitchen garden, and then up to the commercial market garden, field farm, greengrocer, supermarket and mass market. So most of those, we're only going to be on the very start of that. So that's just to introduce some of the words which we use for describing and grouping together crops. So as we work with them more, we end up kind of having more of a sense of what we can achieve and carry on through the year. One little summing up of that would be, when we're first starting, it's probably best to just accumulate a repertoire of different crops and start with half a dozen and see which works. If they work, try them again, and then try another half dozen the next year or the next time you sow things, and get familiar with the whole growth cycle of just a small number of crops. But that can take a very long time to accumulate to get like 50 or 100 different crops going. And so part of this evening is to show you, expose you to what is possible within our climate, and also in the second half to give you this overview, so that rather than building up your understanding bit by bit incrementally, to give you an overview from the top of what is possible. And actually that relates to what I was saying last week about visiting sites. If you can visit an existing grower who's already doing this, like myself, and latch onto what they're doing, within a couple of years you can absorb a lot more than you can just by going out on your own and persevering and failing at one and succeeding at another. So doing both would of course be the best option. Like, do your own stuff, but visit and see what else is possible. So let's